We can start now. I would like to welcome you all. My name is Nikos Panagiotou. I am president of Disinformation Global, and this webinar is part of a series that we have started and offered from March 2020 as part of our efforts to discuss current and very important topics. Digital Communication Network Global, it's a community and initiative that has been initiated 5 years ago, and it consists of a community of doers, of people that are really working on issues of digital communication technologies. It is supported from Citizens Exchanges Office, from State Department and educational programs, whom we really would like to thank for their support. I would like now to pass the floor to the moderator of this very important discussion, and I will keep my role as a discussant. Aisha, the floor is yours.
All right. Good to see everyone. Welcome. Thanks very much for being here. So I think a lot of us here have done our reading. We know that disinformation is a powerful tool in Russia's sort of arsenal for hybrid war. And we know that it has a genealogy that dates back to the sophisticated kind of Soviet propaganda machine. We know, too, that its purpose can be as much a tool to sow panic as fear, and fear as it is to create positive alternative narratives. But the detail and kind of the sophistication behind the most recent series of disinformation campaigns that have led to this moment we find ourselves in is something fascinating and worth exploring. And so that's our topic here this evening. With that, I'd like to introduce Eto Buziashvili of the Atlantic Council's DFRLab in Georgia. Eto, floor is yours.
Thank you, Aisha, so much. I'm really happy to be joining you all today. So Ukraine has been targeted by the Kremlin disinformation for years. And what Kremlin has tested in Georgia back in 2008, they have advanced in Ukraine after. And what we're seeing in the modern online influence operations and disinformation campaigns is an attempt to undermine the notion of objective truth. And this is done by spreading as many conflicting narratives as possible. And this is a significant difference between the USSR's practice of spreading disinformation and the disinformation employed by the modern Kremlin. Aisha, you mentioned that this USSR's practice of disinformation. And back in Soviet times, the USSR leadership and official agencies tried to prove that their invented lie was truth. For example, during the Cold War, a Soviet disinformation campaign blamed the United States for the AIDS virus in its infamous Operation Infection, and claimed that the AIDS was developed in an underground US biological weapons lab. And today, the modern Kremlin is spreading various conflicting narratives in an attempt to undermine this notion of objective truth. They are trying to first convince the audiences that there doesn't exist one truth, and second, to make people exhausted and to stop them searching for the truth. And downing MH17 over eastern Ukraine with the Buk missile belonging to Russian brigade is a great example here. The Kremlin media was pushing for narratives that were blaming NATO, CIA, US, Ukrainian soldier. They even said that it was a plot to kill Russian president. By the way, Bellingcat did a brilliant job in terms of using the open source to investigate downing of Malaysia airline. And in 2022, we're seeing the same tactics used by the Kremlin in the information space around Ukraine and around the world in general. And I'll briefly elaborate on the research that my colleague and I published yesterday. Our research covers how the Russian online outlets were preparing the ground for Russia's next moves, leading to Moscow recognizing the independence of so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And the escalations of the narratives was in line with the Kremlin's next moves to further invade Ukraine. Kremlin-owned and pro-Kremlin online outlets increasingly reported over 4 months leading up to Russia's recognizing the independence of Ukraine's two regions that Ukraine is preparing an attack on Donbas region or on Russia. And between November 2021 to January 2022, coverage in Russian media of the Ukrainian attack preparation narratives rose dramatically. It rose dramatically with a nearly 50% increase in January. And how we came up with the research idea. So while monitoring the Russian information space in late 2021, we observed an increase in the narrative that Ukraine plans to attack. And to measure how the narrative proliferated on Russian media, we selected 10 Kremlin-owned and pro-Kremlin online outlets with a history of spreading narratives, the Kremlin ones. And then we selected 6 Russian keywords to track the coverage of the narratives. And the keywords were the following, like Ukraine, abbreviation for the Armed Forces of Ukraine, provocation, attack, assault, and offense. And we applied the combination of these words to identify the articles pushing the narrative. And in total, we utilized 8 combinations consisting of 6 keywords. And the time period queries went from was beginning of November 2021 through the end of January 2022. And to collect the data, we used the SERP API, a real-time API, which is an application programming interface with an access to Google search engine results page. And the query yielded 2,888 articles containing the keyword combinations that were published between the analyzed period. And to exclude the false narratives, like the articles that used the keywords but did not really spread the narrative, we manually reviewed the content of all the articles collected to identify those spreading the narratives. Yeah, I read up to 3,000 of those articles. So, and it was interesting to see that out of 317 articles spreading the narrative, like the half, like 151 of the articles were published in January. And it means that there was a 50% increase in spread of Ukraine plans attack narrative. And we also observed the differences in narratives throughout the observation period. Like some articles accused Ukraine of provoking a conflict or attack, while others accused NATO and the West, particularly the United States, of being behind the provocations. And while some articles claimed that Ukraine would attack its Donbas region, others named Russia the target. And in the 3 months period, the narrative also became increasingly hostile. In November, for example, articles claimed that Kiev was violating ceasefire agreement, and there was a possibility Kiev could attack. In December, though, the outlets blamed the United States for training extremists for the purpose of attacking Donbas. And in January, then, articles claimed that Ukraine might stage a chemical attack in Donbas and blame it on the separatist authorities, so-called. And of course, the scale of this online operation is much bigger because the research had some limitations, like we only studied 10 online outlets in only 3 months period. And also other synonyms for Russian words like attack or escalations, of course, might have been used by the outlets to spread the narrative. But basically, to sum up, the tactics of Russian online outlets was in line with the steps planned by the Kremlin. And the dramatic increase in number and the narrative becoming more hostile led to Russia recognizing the independence of Ukraine's 2 regions. This is briefly about our latest article. I will stop here and we'll be happy to jump on discussion later.
So this is really fascinating. I want to try to feel out a little bit when we're talking about 10 online outlets, are these kind of Daily Mail-esque Russian outlets, as in they're a couple hundred words, very quick hit articles without much documentation? Is it intended for the public that's reading kind of less credible stuff? Is it Facebook stuff or VKontakte, or is it more like long form documented press?
Yeah, the articles varied in the size. Some were short, some were long, some were referring to the statements made by Russian officials, and others were referring to, for example, statements made by Russian political experts and political and military experts, as they call them. And basically, they were like some short takes that Ukraine is planning attack because of this and that. And some were like elaborating more on the opinions that were pushed by the Kremlin experts.
So it was always, was it coordinated? As in, if you have this escalation and one day we're saying Ukraine is planning attacks and the next day we're saying, oh, not only are they planning attacks, but they're being backed by the West. And did that happen across these outlets at the same time? As in, was it clearly coordinated?
Yeah, our research showed that it was clearly coordinated because the differences between the months and how the narrative was changing and how it was becoming more hostile. Basically, they were like mirroring the narratives. For example, when the RIA.ru published the specific narratives, and Gazeta.ru was kind of saying the same. So basically, it was a clear coordination among these outlets.
So this is really fascinating, and I think your genealogy of it, if I can say, is really impressive. One question that occurs to me before we move to Priyank, and then we'll come back to this discussion, but how does it differ, or does it differ from what the narratives were doing kind of in escalation to the 2014 conflicts?
Yeah, basically we have not observed this kind of coordination before and this kind of scale. And as I mentioned, it was like only 10 outlets that we studied, and there were like up to 3,000 articles that were matching the narratives that were trying for the narratives. And the scale, of course, we are seeing the cross-platform operations, right? It's not only about the online outlets, but the same messages, for example, articles are then amplified via Telegram or Russian social network Kontakte or Facebook, Twitter, etc. And if they are not sharing the links to the articles, they are just repeating the same narratives. So basically the scale is really big.
Interesting. And so much sort of dramatically more coordinated than what we saw in 2014.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And we're going to have to come back to this, but I want to move now to Priyank Mathur of Mythos Labs. Priyank, welcome. You are going to talk now, I believe, about how the Kremlin and how these disinformation narratives are addressing not just the Russian public or the European and American public, but how they're addressing an international public.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thank you to DCN and to all the wonderful speakers, and to you, Aisha. I run Mythos Labs. We have been studying pro-Russian disinformation and propaganda related to Ukraine on Twitter since the fall of 2021. We've been using our AI platform, MyDAC, as well as our team of local researchers led by the very capable Ms. Olga Tokaryuk in Kyiv. And today I thought I'd share a little bit about what we've found so far, especially as Aisha mentioned, as it relates to the international audiences that they're targeting. And then also maybe what this kind of, these trends suggest we might have in store for us in the future as this conflict potentially progresses. So we identified a network of Twitter accounts that is spreading pro-Russian disinfo and propaganda in a coordinated manner. So just like Eto was saying, we also saw an extraordinarily high degree of coordination, which means these accounts were retweeting the same set of source accounts at the same times, espousing the same set of common narratives and pro-Kremlin talking points. Interestingly, we found that their activity has significantly increased. The sharpest increase was towards the end of 2021. In November of 2021, their activity increased by 3,000% compared to what sort of had been the norm in previous months. And it's continued increasing all through January, February, and into March. We found that not only did the number of tweets significantly increase, but the number of accounts that are part of this network that are tweeting pro-Russian disinformation propaganda about Ukraine has also increased by over 20x in just a few weeks. And this increase in activity is not just driven by the creation of new accounts. What we found is that most of these accounts have a history of tweeting pro-Russian propaganda or talking points, but about completely separate topics. Several of them were tweeting about, criticizing American involvement in Libya. Some of them were focused about talking about how the West is being unfair to China with regards parts of Taiwan. And then overnight, almost suddenly in November, they all switched and started in a coordinated fashion talking about Ukraine, which tells us that this is not a random group of people who just happen to feel this. There appears to be some degree of coordination and cooperation across these accounts. Well, what are they saying? Initially, when we started monitoring these accounts in November and December, we found that they were mostly vilifying Ukraine. The narratives were what you would expect. Ukraine is the aggressor. It's a puppet state of the United States. They started the conflict in eastern Ukraine, etc. But gradually, towards the end of the year, and especially now in January and February, we've seen a shift in terms of who they're targeting with their disinformation and their propaganda. They appear to be targeting more international audiences now. We know that because the percentage of tweets that they're putting out in Russian and Ukrainian has decreased, as opposed to the percentage of tweets in English, Italian, French, German, Spanish. So they're really trying to reach a cross-section of European and Western countries, but also some countries in Asia. They're tweeting in, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to slow you down here because I think this is really fascinating, and I want to make sure everyone understands. So these Twitter accounts are addressing an international public. They weren't necessarily doing that before, you're saying, but they started. They pivoted. So it's not like we're talking about someone who's been writing in Turkish for a really long time, continuing to address people in Turkey with greater vitriol towards Ukraine. They pivoted towards writing in other languages in sort of an ad hoc fashion to
That's absolutely
this to the world. Okay.
That's absolutely correct. And some of these accounts had been dedicated to other topics. They were tweeting exclusively in Arabic about Libya. And then overnight, they're now tweeting in English and French about Ukraine. So you can tell that they're controlled by pro-Russian entities, let's leave it at that, that are allocating them as though they were resources in a company being allocated towards whatever problem is most pressing, which at the moment, of course, is clearly Ukraine. And what we saw is that the narratives are fascinating because they really extend beyond what we hear in the media. Some of the narratives targeted at the international community, some of the tweets we found in Urdu, which is a language spoken in Pakistan, were talking about how Pakistan should support Russia in this war because it's sort of like Kashmir, like the Kashmir issue in India, which is a disputed territory that India and Pakistan have been at odds over. We also found tweets urging Turkey not to take sides, talking about why it would be in India's interest to see Putin invade Ukraine. So we really saw a concerted effort to try and build international opinion towards favoring Russia in this conflict. What we also saw in terms of tactics was that earlier on in the fall of 2021, mostly what we were seeing is that these accounts were tweeting anonymous, obviously pro-Kremlin accounts, that looked inauthentic with names like X144T, T57, and things like that. Those tweets weren't doing so well. But in around December, we saw a marked shift in their strategy where they started realizing that instead of tweeting, the Russian Minister of Defense or retweeting him or amplifying them, why not retweet or amplify legitimate prominent actors who have large Twitter followings and just happen to be advocating against Western support for Ukraine. I'm talking about conservative journalists like Glenn Greenwald and folks like Jack Posobiec, and even politicians like Matt Gaetz had a tweet talking about why the US should not invade Ukraine, which was retweeted by multiple accounts that are part of this coordinated pro-Russian network. And it extends to media personalities like more recently Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, Richard Grenell, the former US ambassador to Germany. Their tweets are being amplified by accounts that we know are part of this coordinated network. And it's working out really well for them. They're getting much higher engagement on these tweets. They're leveraging the huge hundreds of thousands of followers that these prominent people have. And so that brings us to sort of where we're at today. What can we expect sort of going forward? Some of the tactics that this network has been using that have proven successful, I would expect to see more of. So we're already seeing them really hone in on this co-opting legitimate actors and trying to fit what they're saying into a pro-Russian narrative. That seems to be working for them. I expect them to do a lot more of that. they're also trying to sow a lot of division within the international community. There were a lot of tweets saying, oh, Germany doesn't want to sell weapons to Ukraine. I guess there are cracks. I guess NATO isn't as strong as we thought. Talking about the Croatian prime minister who made, of course, a statement saying they wouldn't want to send troops into to fight in Ukraine. So I would expect to see more of that. And as the war takes a higher toll on Russians economically and in terms of lives lost, I expect to see more decontextualizing and social proofing, showing one-sided videos about how Ukraine is committing all the atrocities in this conflict, because they're going to have to start refocusing on a domestic audience, on the Russians, who will start questioning why they're in this war and will need a pretty strong justification. So that's my 2 cents, but I turn it over to the other esteemed panelists and to you.
It's really interesting. One of the things that strikes me is we have these Twitter accounts who now have been allocated to address the international public. Are they being assisted by? Is there more homegrown or more pro-Russian voices, not just in the United States, but say in India or say in the Middle East or say in Libya, that are they sensitive enough and nuanced enough to really get into who's an opinion maker in regions of the world outside of like the Europe and the US?
We are seeing a sophisticated level of understanding of these other countries' political environments. So some of the accounts they're retweeting in Asia are accounts of prominent politicians who seem to be having a moment right now and who are definitely the people that local analysts would point to as being influential. Some of the accounts that they are retweeting in Western accounts, of course, already have huge followings, like I mentioned, Tucker Carlson, Matt Gaetz. So there is some understanding, I think. But really, I think their number one criteria is just retweeting prominent personalities that have large Twitter followings, because that will guarantee them higher engagement on these tweets. And ultimately, that's what they're going for.
It's really interesting what you're describing, because I think the buzzword of the past years, since 2014, but even before, has been that we're moving towards a more multipolar world, meaning you have to address multipolar actors. I'm talking to you from Lebanon, but the fracture lines are, I'm curious, and I'd like you to maybe talk more later. The fracture lines are not always where any of us think they are. There's all sorts of religious and sectarian issues elsewhere that aren't at all monolithic and require a really nuanced understanding. What you said about Kashmir too, that's fascinating, but part of me says, are people buying that parallel? Is that getting traction, or is it too kind of bold?
Well, it's certainly resonating in the echo chambers of the accounts that they're retweeting. And I think for now, that's good enough for them. They're not trying to get all of India on their side. They're just trying to get enough people that it creates some doubt and makes this a two-sided conflict where people are saying, well, it could be this way, it could be that way, who knows who's right.
Really interesting. We have to come back to this, but I'm going to move right now to Givi to talk with us about another element of disinformation, which are false flag attacks. Givi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha, and I'm really happy to be here today and joining you. Definitely, like in the course of Russia's military buildup near Ukraine, Kremlin-controlled media outlets amplified plenty of false flag narratives about Ukraine's aggression towards self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And even though Kremlin denies having any plans to invade Ukraine, we see that situation on the ground is different, and Russia may be preparing a context to actually invade Ukraine. And false flags are probably one of the obvious signs of that, and I'm going to briefly review them and also share some key observations. The majority of false flag operations or claims now are kind of simulated attacks, and Kremlin accuses Ukraine of basically carrying out them against civilians, mainly in Donbas region. And almost every day, some Telegram channels come up with a new evidence, kind of allegedly proving that Ukrainian forces, together with Western allies that Russia calls mercenaries, are preparing and conducting different sorts of provocations against civilians. And after that, these messages migrate to Russian mainstream media outlets, and they are, as Ed discussed, amplify these messages in coordination. Some of these false flags contain forged evidence, but some of them are just claims without providing any evidence. So one of the earliest false flag narratives that we observed was voiced by Russian representatives in December, actually on December 21 specifically, when Russian foreign minister claimed that US private military firms were preparing a biochemical weapon in Ukraine to use in Eastern Ukraine. And then separatist leader Pushilin also claimed that Ukraine was planning to poison water supply in Donetsk. So forged evidence of this claim hasn't been really surfaced yet, but since Russia already announced or claimed about it, we may expect that there will be some forged evidence about it, and maybe open source community should really try to keep an eye on it. And then January was relatively quiet month, I would say, when it comes to false flag narratives and claims and operations, and mainly because this is the time when Russia sent its letter to NATO on some security demands, and then Kremlin received an answer. Russia was unhappy, and starting from early February, we see another round of false flag operations. So on February 1, for instance, so-called Ministry of Defense of Donetsk claimed that Ukrainian special forces planted a bomb in Donetsk administrative building, and Donetsk militia prevented this explosion. And they didn't really provide any evidence of this bomb, but they claimed that it contained 4 electronic detonators. And then after that, on February 5th, marginal Telegram channel posted the news that Ukraine and armed for that news that basically Ukraine started a massive shelling of civilian areas in Donbass, and it also didn't turn out to be true. But post contained just a very unclear photo depicting the smoke and no evidence of any casualties or any other footage whatsoever. And one more trend that we observe is that before forged evidence appears, Kremlin media is preparing a pretext for it. For instance, on February 7th, leaders of Ukrainian breakaway regions claimed that Polish mercenaries arrived in Donbass in order to carry out some terrorist acts. And then on February 14, Lugansk leaders claimed that Ukraine created a secret network of saboteurs, and Polish mercenaries were part of this network. And already on February 18, probably you know very well that this quite famous video emerged in which basically there was some sort of like clashes, and separatist leaders claimed that they prevented an attempt by Ukrainian sabotage groups to blow up a chlorine tank in Horlivka city. And they also claimed they intercepted conversation in Polish. This is, again, continuation of what they started on February 7th, but first they just claim about it, and then they also provide some forged evidence. And also on February 18th, the separatist leaders claimed that that Ukraine tried to blow up, or not tried, but actually blew up a car on a parking lot in Donetsk, which belonged to a government official of Donetsk, and also open source community debunked it, and it didn't turn out to be true. But again, this type of false flag operations happen every day, and this list of is not exhaustive, and probably to discuss like the broader question that everyone is asking now is like why Russia manufactures false flags that are so easy to verify and to prove that they are false. Another question is why Telegram is used as a main medium to publish these doctored videos, because Telegram kind of retains the metadata of the video that is posted there, and then it's easy for people to basically verify this. So there are like, I think, at least two answers on this question. First of all, it's kind of obvious, or maybe not very obvious for everyone, that these false flag operations are mainly for Russian domestic audience. And in Russia, Kremlin controls media, and it has also control on the narrative. So, and also multiple public opinion polls show that Russians do not really follow any alternative source when it comes to news about foreign policy, and especially Ukraine, because people in Russia are really tired of listening all this propaganda about Ukraine from state-controlled media. And I think recently Levada poll showed that basically around like 5% of people only try to find information about Ukraine from alternative, like non-Russian sources. So I think Kremlin understands this, and Kremlin knows that it's easy to sell these videos for local audience, but probably it's not true for the international audience. And also, secondly, and Eto mentioned at the beginning that Kremlin is pushing plenty of narratives and false stories about many different events. And I think they also understand that not all these narratives can gain traction. And probably the same logic applies with the videos that they manufacture and then disseminate. So maybe they don't really hope that everyone will buy those videos, but some of them can gain more traction, and that would be still seen as a success for the Kremlin. But overall, I think Kremlin also with these videos tries to create an impression that situation is really terrible in Ukraine, and exploit this crisis that it created around Ukraine. I think that's all on my side, and happy to answer questions.
So just to go back here, and sorry, because I had an internet hiccup. Most of these false flag narratives are designed and, in fact, targeting a Russian domestic public.
Yes, I would say that the main target of those narratives are Russian people, because simply Kremlin knows that they do not really seek alternative news about Ukraine rather than, let's say, Russian TV and printed media. And that's why it's easier for Kremlin to sell all this in Russia.
And they're certainly not reading Bellingcat or other open source investigative narratives that are raising questions about the veracity of certain. Another question. Yeah, continue.
That's a very good question. I think they do, but as I said, and if you also look at, for instance, there was an interview of Medusa 2 days ago when head of Levada Center discussed that basically Ukraine, Russian people are really tired of listening all this Kremlin story about Ukraine, and they kind of try to switch off TV when they listen something about Ukraine again. And the number of people who are again looking at Bellingcat or DFRLab or other sources is really small in Russia, but maybe my colleagues have a different view on that.
You know, it reminds me, throughout the war, before the false flags, there's also been just a lot of, haven't there been sort of fake, I want to say fake incidents, reports of atrocities that don't happen, reports of genocide and just sort of other ghastly things that may not be designed to escalate towards war, but are bloody and horrible and miserable to hear about, and that repeatedly get spread. So do you think that might sort of contribute to this exhaustion we're talking about. There's been so much fake stuff by now that I think any sane person would be pretty overwhelmed.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you look at Russian media, and we as analysts have to really consume all this information pushed by Kremlin media, and it's also very exhaustive for us. But then you can imagine, like, when you are live in Russia and this TV is on at home on the background, and maybe you are not really willing to like deliberately watch TV, but you are still exposed to this information, and then you will see like how many hours Kremlin propagandists spend on just talking negative news about Ukraine. I really understand that like average Russians are really fed up with listening so much negative story about Ukraine. So yeah.
Someone in our audience wants to ask you, as things escalate, will it be harder to combat false flags?
Probably yes, because I think there is also a chance that even open source researchers will be overwhelmed by the amount of false stories that will be disseminated, and it will be also difficult to probably find the focus and like really concentrate on the most relevant stories that you need to amplify. And we already feel this, for instance, in our team, that we have to really put more time, more attention, and it's getting difficult. But I think, and then especially judging by the number of reports we get on a daily basis, like debunking all these false flags, it's very promising, because a couple of years ago, it was not like there were so many people doing this. And also now it seems like it's kind of easier to verify all these videos now than it was maybe 5-6 years ago. So we will see. It's not easy, but it's manageable so far.
Okay, and another one of our audience members, Mitchell, asks, he says the SBU posted audio on YouTube of separatists discussing false flag operation and expressing concern, and I'm sorry, Mitchell, I'm just trying to get this right, expressing concern that they're going to be sacrificed. The separatists are going to be sacrificed by Moscow. Has that gained any traction online?
I don't really know what exactly the person refers to, but let me read a question again, and maybe we'll be able to answer it during Q&A session. If it can.
Mitchell, that sounds interesting. You can also PM the audio to me if you like. Okay, interesting questions. I know there are more, but I'm just going to move on right now, discussing these false flag operations and discussing kind of the, in general, Elliot Higgins at Bellingcat, great admirer of your organization, and you've done some amazing work at combating false information like this. Welcome, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I want to talk today about the experience of the past week when it comes to the disinformation that's been identified, how it's been basically picked apart by an online community, and how that's had an impact, I think, on the narrative in the Western media, at least, around many of these events. Very kind of early on when these images first started coming out, so a strong example being this supposed group of Polish saboteurs who were killed trying to attack chlorine tanks, and this video appeared online. We started seeing the kind of online open source community coming together and start picking this stuff apart. And in this particular example, someone who was familiar with Telegram realized the metadata was left in this video. And within that metadata was the XMP data from Adobe, which basically was the blueprint to how the file had been fabricated from 2 separate videos. And that, I think, for the media was a very interesting narrative, because it's one thing to say, oh, this stuff is fake, but when you can show them the exact blueprint of how it was faked, it becomes a very compelling story. Then almost immediately after that, we had the leaders of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, put out a video supposedly filmed on February 18th about evacuations, and both the metadata in those videos, again shared on Telegram where we could see the metadata, dated them to the 16th. Now, if one of those files was the 16th, maybe the settings were wrong on the camera, but when you have two files from two separate sources, that starts becoming incredibly suspicious. So again, that was started to feed into a building kind of Western media narrative about this stuff being fake. And it was a narrative that was being heavily covered. Back in 2014, when we were first finding this stuff, barely anyone was reporting on it, because I think for one thing, you didn't have a very well-established open source community that was kind of debunking this stuff within the news cycle. You also didn't have the understanding, I think, among journalists about the value of doing this and their kind of networked connection to that community that had emerged. You also have now a situation where you've had an open source community from 2014 engaged with the conflict with Ukraine, who kind of understand the landscape better. And in a way, they kind of can react, and they've come together basically instantly because they've kind of pre-existed before, and the people who are kind of fresh to this have a community to kind of engage with immediately, which we didn't have back in 2014. So from the perspective of the kind of open source side of things, we're actually very, very effective at debunking stuff that is frankly extremely low quality fakes. Today I've been looking at a video following it. There was a blogger who's been following this conflict since 2014 called Glasnost Gone, and he was looking at a video of a supposed IED attack, and video footage filmed by a pro-separatist kind of Western YouTuber on the scene. Patrick Lancaster showed one of the bodies where there was an extremely obvious incision in the skull that was from an autopsy, and we've spoken to experts, forensic experts, who've looked at that and said that is 100% a cut from an autopsy, not from an explosion. So they've clearly used dead bodies that have already been autopsied to fake this explosion. There's other elements of the explosion that also indicate that it's a fake, but this is the clearest indication of all. And this is something that's been debunked within 24 hours. And there was another case where there was a claim of a cross-border incursion by Ukrainian forces in the most obvious fashion possible in broad daylight with armored vehicles. And within an hour, we were able to geolocate that into basically the heart of separatist territory, where it would have been completely ridiculous for those vehicles to go there. Plus, other people have identified those vehicles as only being used by Russian armed forces. So the rapidity of these debunks is actually, I think, really helping engage the Western media in kind of the debunking and bring that into the news cycle in the West. Now, of course, in Russia, they aren't seeing these debunks as easily as anywhere else. They certainly aren't appearing in the media. So, in a way, the kind of Russian media reaction to it and the kind of Western media reaction to it are two very different things. But I think it is a real significant change from what we were seeing back in 2014 with how the media is engaging with this kind of stuff.
The Western media has learned, you're saying.
Yeah, I think they've learned to not only understand what open source is, but also to trust that you can get useful information from these communities, and also picked up some of the verification skills they can use to check these claims themselves, because much of the reporting I've seen by larger media organizations looking at this stuff say we've checked this stuff ourselves and it's true. So in a way, we're giving them leads to investigate. And for me, that's a big part of how the open source community works. It's not just us telling them stuff, it's us giving them the signpost to look at this stuff themselves, look at the evidence and do that analysis themselves so they can trust the analysis. For us at Bellingcat, one of the key things we're also doing at the moment is we're already archiving material in relation to Ukraine, including Russian troop movements inside Russia, and we're working with organizations like the Conflict Intelligence Team and the Insider on that work. And I think that's very important, because one thing that we'll be looking at as well is the inevitable war crimes that are going to be committed in this conflict. And we know how Russia fights wars, and we know what they do when there is a conflict incident. They'll lie about it, they'll put out disinformation. So rapid verification of these incidents, I think, is going to be very important, and investigating them to a high standard so they can be trusted and used by international bodies such as the UN or accountability bodies in the long term is very important. For us, that's one of the more tricky parts. We know how to do it, we've developed processes around it, but we don't have the kind of resources to do something that intensive within a week. So one thing we're finding ourselves doing is kind of, we've got kind of all the parts that we need. We have the understanding, we have the kind of everything we need. We just need the resources to actually do this stuff. So we're relying a lot now on our, working late into the night, doing it ourselves, and also trying to put together funding for that kind of thing. But my feeling is once the conflict really begins and we start seeing these crimes, that documentation of those war crimes in a very rapid and accurate way from trusted kind of open source investigators such as Bellingcat will be very, very important for, I think, both the media's understanding, but also the understanding of the international community of what events are actually happening. Because we've seen time and time again that any conflict incident, be it Syria or Ukraine, Russia will happily put out the most crassest disinformation about it, fakes and all kinds of things. I'm hoping that if they do that, it's going to be as poor quality as the disinformation that's been coming out so far, because it's made our life a lot easier. And I don't really see any kind of, for me, it's almost a disappointment that, I've been working on Russian disinformation since 2014, from really 2013 with Syria. And it's like they've learned nothing. They've almost regressed in the quality of what they're doing. I mean, they're making it almost too easy for us. I was kind of expecting this conflict would kind of bring us some kind of new and interesting ways they're lying to us, but it's got worse. It's become dumber and it's become easier to spot, which is great for us, not so great for Russia. And I think thanks to the
production values are not any higher. You're saying the production values are the same or worse? Yeah,
it's just, and it just seems lazy. And even when they went to the UN with their kind of document about the genocide that they claimed happening, it was based off Russia Today news links. And I can understand why, they're just creating a tiny little fig leaf for themselves. But when we move into questions about war crimes and accountability, that's not going to be as effective as I think they believe it will be. And that could actually put them in a very difficult position when there are solid investigations coming out from trusted organizations going to bodies like the UN and the ICC and other international bodies, where there will be questions about what can be done about this, and that they trust that these investigations are accurate and that we can demonstrate repeatedly that Russia is lying about what's happened in these incidents. And with Syria, that didn't have so much of an impact, but I think with Ukraine, it will really make a difference, and the media is prepared to cover that kind of stuff as well.
I have some questions for you from the audience. Someone is asking, does debunking a story lead to less or more media coverage in Russia and abroad? Once you've debunked the story, can that have the effect of amplifying it?
I think in the cases that we've been looking at in the last week in particular, the amplification has been really look at these really obvious fakes that Russia has been doing, isn't it remarkable? And that's kind of the narrative I think that's been building through the media. And because it's not just one video, it's been one thing after another, that narrative has kind of grown, and there's more media organizations citing the earlier examples as this kind of ongoing, almost ridiculous disinformation campaign that Russia's running. And, we understand that, this is really intended for a Russian audience, but I think when you see the reaction of the Western media of how they're reporting this, they're kind of almost appalled that this disinformation is just so badly made, when we've had years and years of being told how amazingly sophisticated Russian disinformation is, and now they're doing like just the laziest rubbish possible, really.
It reminds me of how there's a split in outlets today where half seem to insist that Putin is a genius chess player who can manipulate the world policy, and then the other half seem to assert that he's actually kind of gone off his rocker. So there, that diversion, is it really so sophisticated anymore, or is it just overconfident maybe?
I suspect it may be the people that he's working with aren't particularly sophisticated, because it's the separatists who are kind of faking a lot of this stuff, and they just don't seem to have the skills to do it to any kind of level of quality.
But also, devil's advocate here, might they have felt that institutions and in fact sort of traditional alliances have eroded to a point where they don't need to be as sophisticated in faking disinformation?
I mean, it's possible, and it might be that their experience with the conflict in Syria is seeing these kinds of investigations not really being taken, that far.
Say a little bit more there for our information.
Yeah, and I think maybe they've kind of perhaps misjudged how this stuff would be kind of taken, by the West, and I think also by, policymakers and other actors who will actually be interested in doing something with this and using this as examples to their own public of, what Russia has been doing and how crude it is.
I'm just looking at our questions here. So some people are making or posing kind of the same question or more broadly asking is the reason these attacks are less sophisticated is to just filter out people in many ways and just to continue pandering to their base of people who will believe it?
Well, I mean, in Russia, I expect because of the way the media is controlled, that might be kind of more viable. But one thing I've noticed a lot from the usual voices in the West who kind of, you know, the tangies basically, is they're not really focused on these videos. They're almost ignoring them. Because I think they're seeing these debunks happen, and because they're so obvious, they don't want to cite them or kind of get drawn into citing stuff that will be immediately debunked afterwards. So they're more focusing on the broad issues of, you know, oh, Ukraine isn't really a country, and that kind of, or it's full of Nazis and that kind of stuff. But when it comes to the specific videos, they just really aren't engaging with them. That might also be possibly because a lot of this community that exists, this kind of counterfactual community around conflict, has really focused a lot on the conflict in Syria. And they don't really understand Ukraine. They don't really even know the names of anyone involved because it's not been popular enough. It hasn't made it to the TV where they can go on their, you know, YouTube channel and complain about it and say how awful everything is. So I don't think they've kind of got their own kind of quasi-institutional understanding of the conflict that they can actually really comment on it. So they're just kind of parroting various figures that they're already quite familiar with, but those figures in themselves aren't really engaged with the conflict, so aren't really saying much that I think it's really dampened their effectiveness, basically because they don't really understand the topics they're talking about. They're just very reactionary and taking a very kind of anti-Western viewpoint on it. And when they see, I think, these very rapid debunks of videos, and it, you know, makes them a bit more nervous about saying, oh, look at this terrible video, when an hour later they're being told that they're idiots for believing it in the first place.
Very, very well said. I'm looking. We have really good questions from the audience here. I want to, at this point, Elliot, open the floor a little bit more to discussion. So I think one of the points that's come up has been really interesting for me. Ed has spoken to this, and I'd like to hear from Priyanka and Jibi as well. Is we're comparing what Russia's kind of done throughout this war, creating false flags, manufacturing atrocities, and creating a propaganda narrative. And in some ways, Etta, you found that it's gotten a little bit more sophisticated and coordinated. But in some ways, is it fair to say they're still on the same talking points, which are knee-jerk kind of anti-Western narratives, and then they're still doing the same broad tactics for sort of fabricating reasons to go to war? Is this going to get old? Do you think it's going to get old? Does it have the same traction as before? Is there any evolution that you're all watching for?
I can start.
Yeah.
Basically, narratives are like the same throughout these years. They are just, I don't know, becoming a bit more sophisticated and just adding some new elements. But the good thing is that what the fact checkers, also researchers, and the Western intelligence service are doing. And the crucial part here is exposing that the researchers are exposing how the Kremlin disinformation is working. And when you show the evidences to the audience, it's more convincing, as Elliot mentioned, showing the metadata analysis, for example, of the video. It's very convincing, right? Because you can check it yourself. And exposing the plans of the Kremlin by the Western intelligence services on the one hand, and by the researchers on the other, is something that helps in not being like behind the threat actors, because unfortunately we have been like always one or two steps back. Like they just spread this information is here, and also the element of the content being sensational plays a huge role, because we, the researchers, have facts, but the threat actors have some stories, like the sensational stories, the sensational narrative that are more engaging, right? And the threat actors are not bound by the facts. They say whatever that it is necessary for achieving their goal, and once it's spread, that's it. And this exposing part makes the audiences more resilient and more informed about what can be expected by the Kremlin and the threat actors in general?
I think that's well said. I think it was Gibby, you touched upon kind of, and we touched upon the fatigue that the Russian domestic public sort of has or might have with these false flags and these constant narratives. Maybe too broadly philosophical, but I'm going to throw this out. What is the end of this? I mean, where do you go? Because I think we've all gotten, as sort of, maybe we're just all nerds, but I've gotten a fatigue with Russian disinformation, and I don't even study it, you know, but I've read enough RT and I just see it enough on my Twitter that the cynicism is familiar enough to me that I just don't care anymore. Sometimes, I mean, I have a little voice in me. Do you see a possibility that they could just run out these talking points and have to come up with new ones? Is there maybe a better way to ask that is there a change in how the public is engaging with these narratives? Do you see any change, and do you see as much engagement as there was? Do they have to work harder for the same audience?
Well, I would say that I see only negative changes when it comes to the impact of Russian disinformation on Russian public again, because, for instance, if you look at how Russians felt towards Ukrainians in 2013, it was quite positive. And if you now look at the numbers of the recent opinion polls that was conducted in 2021 in December, around 25% more Russians see Ukraine as negative. But also we should keep in mind that Russians try to differentiate and really see this conflict as conflict between NATO and Russia, not necessarily conflict between Russia and Ukrainians. This is the trend that everyone is talking about in Russia. But basically, yeah, I mean, it has disinformation has some impact, and also Kremlin disinformation sometimes has really immediate impact. For instance, again, going back to 2021, Russians really saw Ukraine in a positive light, mostly at the beginning of 2021, and then this trend deteriorated by summer 2021, and then it started again to recover by the end of last year. And now there are no latest surveys, but we will see how it goes and what Russia will do with Ukraine after all. But one thing is for sure that basically the overall awareness of how much false information Kremlin is pushing is also growing in Russia, but also in neighboring countries. Like, I'm originally from Georgia, and the number of people in Georgia who acknowledge the existence of Russian disinformation in Georgia is increasing every year. And I would say that this awareness of the existence of the problem is already part of the solution, in the sense that maybe it results to a greater resilience. But where is the end point? I have no answer. But again, I think that so far there is no improvement in terms of, let's say, the amount of information, false information we receive from Russia, but probably people are more aware of this problem, and again, it maybe leads to eventual solution, but I don't know when it's gonna happen.
Right, we have some questions from the.
Can I also comment on something, Aisha? I'm sorry.
Please, welcome.
I would like a comment on the following. As we have seen from a latest video that has been appeared in the Russian TV regarding some saboteurs that they were trying to enter Donbass region, and it has proven to be abstracts from a Finnish army exercise, etc. Do you think that there is a change regarding and in relation with the mediums and the audience? Do you think that they might aim actually also to produce false narratives through traditional media, aiming in older generations? Thank you.
Nikos, we're asking about manufacturing false narratives through traditional media.
Yes, like the latest false video that has been produced and played over the Russian TV. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Eto, we talked a bit to that, but I'd like to hear more. We talk a lot about Telegram channels, but are there more traditional publications participating in these false narratives?
Yeah, unfortunately, we are mostly monitoring the social media because it's an area of our expertise, but definitely the stuff from the traditional media is being proliferated on the social media. But here, here's a very interesting thing. I would like to comment more on the social media. A couple of days ago, Kremlin-owned outlet RIA reported that the video platform TikTok blocked its account after removing a video from the so-called Donetsk People Republic's leader, Denis Pushilin, that was calling for the evacuation, the video that Elliot was referring to, which appeared to be recorded 2 days prior to going live. And the notification RIA said that they received from the TikTok was that your account was permanently closed due to some multiple violations of the community guidelines. And later, RIA reported that Roskomnadzor, Russia's communication regulator, intervened in the situation. It's a quote. And as a result, TikTok unblocked RIA's account and restored the deleted video of Pushilin. And the Kremlin-owned outlet stated that TikTok clarified that blocking occurred by mistake. And here I just wanted to highlight that I would agree with my colleague's point, Emerson Brookings' point, that each platform's approach to the imagery and the video content will determine the accuracy of the historical record, because everything be stored there, it will be there, right? And how the hashtags or how the content is promoted or not on each platform will definitely be shaping the public perception of the events.
Thank you. I think that's sorry. Hold on. I'm going to refresh because no. Okay. All right. I think I'm back. I think I can see everyone. Sorry, internet hiccup. Priyank, we've been talking about the timeline since 2014 of how false flag narratives have changed, how Russian disinformation has built to this moment as opposed to previous moments, talking about how Russia's addressing an international public. Is that something they've started to do more recently in the past couple of years, or have they been doing that for a long time and we just haven't been aware of it? And how has it changed since I think Elliot brought up the Syria conflict and now?
It seems to be more pronounced in this conflict. We studied Russian disinformation in Libya for the last 3 years, and we've not seen this level of concern about international opinion from pro-Russian accounts there. It's mostly directed at a domestic Libyan audience. So it's definitely more pronounced. But I will say, just if I may, on the point about the deterioration of quality in the false flag sort of like propaganda and disinformation that they're putting out. I think organizations like Bellingcat are doing amazing work. And so they're the experts in sort of knowing, if the quality is going up or down. My thought on, after observing sort of them and studying them for the last few years, is that they've kind of realized that tapping into people's confirmation bias is a lot more cost efficient than trying to produce high quality disinformation videos. So I think that the people that they're trying to target are folks who already have such a strong confirmation bias, whether they're in Russia or supportive of Russia, that they don't really need a high level of quality to convince them that something is real. And actually, another part of our company is we work with social media influencers a lot to create counter-narrative content. And one thing I've learned from my friends in the influencer community, something that they've all learned in the last 5 years, You look at the average YouTube video 7 or 8 years ago from an influencer, it was really high quality. People were investing a lot of money in good cameras, good lenses. And then in the last few years, they've realized that consumers actually just want frequency of content. They don't really care about the production quality that much. And I think strangely, that's something that Russian disinformation content producers have figured out as well. That if we just bombard people with a lot of content, keep saying the same message again and again, even if the quality is low, it's going to be effective. So I can, I think the fact that the quality is low, it still worries me, because I don't think they're doing this without a plan for how they can still be effective.
Really interesting, I think, and good observation. We have a question, and I think I'll direct it at this moment towards Elliot. What people creating these false flag operations, fake war crime videos or other kind of unsettling videos, what do we know about them? Do we know if they're hired by the Kremlin? Are they volunteers? Have they ever been identified or held accountable?
I think that's
have we found their Adobe accounts?
Yeah, I think it's one of the mysteries that we have at the moment, because I don't know if this stuff is being kind of centrally organized through, the GRU. I mean, we know they're involved with information operations in Eastern Ukraine, that they've, been involved with faking videos and other content, and they've been involved with disinformation operations such as Bonanza Media, for example, the Netherlands-based independent media organization who did a lot on MH17 leaks. It's like, if they are centrally organized by the GRU, then the GRU is performing extremely poorly, because the quality of that content is shockingly low. And I know, again, it's for a Russian audience, but even then you would expect them to put in, some real effort into this. I mean, that car bombing video, the ID video was, it was very, they obviously had to find a couple of corpses to put in the car, which in itself is an effort, but you'd expect them to find corpses that actually look like they hadn't been previously autopsied, and it just seems completely absurd. So I kind of wonder, are these orders coming down to the separatists, and they say, we need to fake some stuff, and they try and go off and do their own thing, and they don't really know what they're doing, and they end up with these ridiculous things? Are they receiving really specific orders about supporting certain narratives? I'm not sure if the fakery comes from the narratives or the narratives comes from the fakery. It seems actually it's more the kind of groundwork is kind of being laid, and then these fakes come out. But I don't know if that's not really a planned thing. It's more a reaction to what's already coming out. Because if it's a planned thing, they're doing a really, really bad job of executing this stuff and pulling it off. So I honestly don't know. I mean, it's such poor quality that I always hope, for the sake of Russia as a nation, that their intelligence services aren't so incompetent that they put that kind of stuff out. But it looks like they are.
Okay, interesting. We don't know of any sort of independent contractors, or how you have tweet farms you can engage to up your image.
I think that's probably a separate thing. I mean, that's dealt through the traditional method of creating kind of influence networks, but the actual faking of the videos itself seems extremely amateurish at the moment. It doesn't seem like they've brought anyone in to do that, anyone with any kind of specialization anyway.
Okay. All right. I think let's see, we've run past our time, so I should probably wrap this up, although it's been extremely interesting. I'm told that the audience can send their questions to the email account of DCN, that is dcnglobal@gmail.com. Will someone put that in the comments? And yeah, I think unless we have any final questions, well, we have a zillion questions. But really, maybe we'll just go for a final remark from everyone. Does that sound good? And then I'll let people go for this evening. So starting with Etta, what would be your closing remarks for our panelists here?
Yeah, I would just sum up with saying that observing the Kremlin media outlets might be telling a lot to us. as they have been in line with the Kremlin steps, and how they escalate in narratives and in number of the narratives, and in terms of narratives being more and more hostile in time. This should definitely be kind of good flag of what Kremlin might be planning. Of course, not the specific plans, but that Kremlin will be further escalating.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, and it seems from what you've found that it's very coordinated and directed long before we started covering or even worrying so much about the current crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we have been observing like the specifically Ukrainian information for a space for, I don't know, for the 2021, but it was like the late 2021 when we saw that it was the escalation, and that's why we decided to kind of count in numbers and have all the statistics.
Be interesting to ask, like, at what point in 2021 and what could have precipitated it. You know what I mean? Like what moment in world politics or in the events of that time might have inspired the Kremlin to start building towards this? Maybe a question for another panel.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's the question for another panel. For the geopolitical panel.
We're fascinated by that. And this. Givi, how would you wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say that this is an interesting time for all people who are kind of OSINT curious and who want to develop their skills in identifying disinformation or false operations and then debunk them. So I would recommend everyone not to wait for different organizations who are working on this for years already and try to have some innovative approaches to all the false information that is coming from Russia these days. And definitely, probably this is the moment which we should all take advantage of in terms of just improving our OSINT skills and also help OSINT community to contribute with our own research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Givi. Priyank, and thanks very much, all of you, for your contributions.
Sure. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining. I would just sort of say that I think that it's a refreshing approach that the West is taking to be very open and transparent about the intelligence we have regarding Russian disinformation. I think it's effective because it puts them in a difficult position. If they do what we say they're going to do, they look like, you know, we know them very well and we're very smart and they hate making us look smart. And if they don't do what we say they were going to do, makes them look like we scared them off. So I think it's a good tactic. And for those of us in the OSINT community, it's nice to be open and to be able to collaborate and to sort of tear down some of the walls of secrecy that have unnecessarily, I think, hindered our progress as a whole. So I look forward to more cooperation with organizations like the ones represented on this panel and everyone who's in attendance. So if there's any opportunities to collaborate, y'all are doing great work. Please do shoot us a note, and it's exciting to work on this together. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Elliot.
Yeah, I think one thing that's, I think, really going to be different from 2014 is the understanding of how valuable documenting things like war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law with open source information is, not only to the organizations who are doing it, but to those organizations that will use that information in the future, particularly for accountability. So I think when this conflict really does start going and we do start seeing those kind of conflict events, I think we're going to see a lot more kind of rapid kind of analysis and actually awareness that this stuff is going on. And I think we'll see a kind of larger push from the Russian state against this kind of thing, but I'm not expecting much from those pushes. So I'm almost going to look forward to enjoying picking them apart when they do come. So, you know, fortunately, the great thing about open source is that everyone can get involved. So hopefully some of the people on this stream today will be able to get involved with that as well.
Wonderful. Everyone, thanks for brilliant contributions, for your patience, and for this conversation. It's been, I think, really informative for all of us, and at a very important moment. So thanks very much, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.